Okay, so that's going live. Okay. All right, we are live on YouTube, and now I'll pull us up on Zoom. Okay, and we're live on Zoom also. Here comes everybody. So as everybody's coming in, we're going to do, as usual, a little entertainment with owl calls, which I sprung upon Lauren. She was not aware I was going to ask her to do owl calls. So Lauren,
I've been practicing in the shower.
Can you do a few burrowing owl calls, talk about context, who does them, when they do them, describe some of the other ones?
Sure. So the classic woohoo, woohoo, that's a burrowing owl call. Generally males calling that. Females do as well, but mostly during breeding season, the males, they do just the beak clack, which, I mean, I can't really do it because I don't have a beak, but
I'm disappointed.
Do it with my teeth. The cool thing about burrowing owls is when they're young, in the burrow, the young will make a sound like a rattlesnake. So that's a defense mechanism. So especially since the young can't really get away. And when we're checking in some of our breeding pens or out in the field, we open up sort of part of the burrow and then we hear that rattlesnake sound, sort of a shh. We're kind of like, oh, is this owls or are these rattlesnakes?
Generally, a rattlesnake in there? Do you have a rattlesnake in a burrow?
We have, but more at the front of the burrow. So we've come across and we've seen one in the front of a burrow, and we've only had one time where there was a snake at the front and we knew there were babies in the back, and the parents were outside flying around like crazy. So what we did is we ended up grabbing, as the snake was at the front, so we went, because of our artificial burrows, we were able to access the other part, and we were able to get all the babies out. So we took them out, and then we took them back to the facility just for one day. And then we went back out and the snake was gone and the parents were still there. So then we put the babies back. So yeah, the snakes don't really go for the babies or the eggs. It's more like the food that we're feeding them, and then also like the shelter. So not necessarily so we have the Pacific Northern rattlesnake up here, the Western rattlesnake. So I'm not sure what the other rattlesnakes would be like in the Southern United States, but the ones up here aren't necessarily going for the eggs or the young, but just the burrow itself for the shelter, and probably some of the mice we feed. So, and so we were talking about education owls because you guys have a new education owl, and they do like a little squeak or a chuck, like you were saying, like a little, just like if they like you. And Joe did a good one of like the two calls, but Carla, or if you did.
Yeah, well, it was kind of, go for it, Joe.
Oh, so it's like a woohoo.
Yeah, that one. Yeah, that's kind of like, yeah, hey, I like you.
She often comes up. She often comes and says, just like when we come up to her, she goes, "Ooh."
Yeah,
just a single one.
Ours, Pluto, just kind of does like a. Okay. And then sometimes and then you were saying, and they do a bunch of the series of ones. What was the one, Carla? You were like a kind of a.
Well, it's chittering. Kind of that little thing. She'll do a little.
Yeah.
But then it kind of rolls together into a whole bunch of chucks really fast.
Yeah, and so if, like with ours, find if our education owl does that, like a bunch of them at the same time, and usually it's like kind of annoyed. And our owls in the facility, sometimes I'll hear them going like kind of chittering at each other, and it's if they're like fighting over a piece of food or something. And then of course there's a classic, a lot of owls do that. It's kind of like a hiss and then putting their wings up. So that really means like, I really hate you, please get away. Or just, yeah. No, okay. Well, in Canada, they say please.
Yeah.
No, but they were like,
Swear
get
word
out of my
here.
space. Yeah. They're like, get out of my space. So we see that a little bit more in our wild owls, which is great. But occasionally, like our education owls do that, especially like if a dog comes around or something. So yeah.
And they do an alarm call also.
Yes. Yes. So they'll do an alarm call like when there is like red-tailed hawks and things coming overhead. So yeah, I'm not really good at doing that either. I should have practiced this before.
Would have helped if I mentioned it more than 20 minutes before.
Yes, I feel like I don't want to do the wrong thing. So, but yeah, I think it's like they've said probably about 14 different kinds of vocalizations for burrowing owls. So quite varied, which is kind of nice. So like talking to each other and communicating to each other a little bit more. And I mean, they have some long distance calls, but also calls for sort of short distances, I think, too, which is kind of maybe unusual for an owl. I don't know how many calls do like great horned owls do.
Well, there's several different kinds of hoots, several different kinds of squawks, and several different kinds of chitters, and then of course the hisses and bill claps.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
And some of them are graded, like the chitters can be anything from soft, quiet, conversational, screaming and ear piercing, like, oh my gosh, let go of me, I'm going to kill you.
Yeah. With the burrowing owls, I guess they can't maybe get it as loud, but they do. It's just really cute when they do that, when they kind of scream or something. So yeah. Oh,
and then we were talking too about the one that just sounds like you're murdering them if you're handling them or something.
Yeah, it's just like
like dying rabbit or something. Oh, you're killing me.
Yeah, so that's like only the education owls seem to do that. The wild ones, just if you wrap them up to band them or whatever, they just lay still. But the education owls really want to let you know that that's just not, I don't like this. So. Okay,
how about we move on to what I actually asked you here to do, which you prepared to talk about.
God, that's embarrassing.
Thank you for letting us put you on the spot and being game for doing that. I appreciate it.
Okay.
It's always fun to talk about vocalizations because people always think they make like the one call, and they have owls have repertoires, and there's a whole lot of different things they say. So it's always fun to learn about them.
Yeah, definitely.
So thank you everybody for joining us. I see we still have some folks coming in, but we're going to get started here. For those of you who haven't joined us before, Joe and I are joining you from the International Owl Center in the whopping metropolis of Houston, Minnesota. Population less than 1,000 people down in the little toe of Minnesota. And we just sort of evolved here because you would have never put an owl center here. It just sort of happened. And then when the world shut down with the pandemic, then we had to close our facility and came up with the idea of, well, we know all these cool owl people from all over the world. We're all stuck at home. We all got forced to learn how to use Zoom. So let's have some presentations. And then the goal was to make them free. So everybody anywhere in the world could attend, without barriers of finances and exchange rates and things like that. So we just opt to continue them to be free. And for those of you who are able to donate, yay, because that's what supports this. There's a whole lot that goes on behind the scenes to make this happen. And we have to have a Zoom webinar license. And our presentations, the folks doing the presentations like Lauren donate their time to do these. Thank you very much for doing that. So thank you, Lauren, and to everybody that's donating to help make these possible, and to everybody watching, because it wouldn't be any fun if nobody showed up. We want people to learn more about owls. And today, last I checked this morning, we had people signed up from 12 different countries and 28 different states. So it's really fun that this is reaching a lot of people and we're getting some good conversation going. This presentation will be saved on our YouTube channel for later viewing. So you can either find that by going to YouTube, searching for International Owl Center and going to our channel. And there's a playlist of Virtual Owl Expert Speaker Series videos, and there's quite a few in there. Or you can go to the International Owl Center's website. Under programs, you'll find the Virtual Owl Expert Speaker Series, and then a list of links to all the presentations that have been saved. So there's a lot of great stuff there if you haven't seen these before. A few housekeeping things about this presentation. The chat in Zoom will be disabled. So you can't chat in there. If you have questions, use the Q&A, which is usually at the bottom of your screen, depending on what device you're using. And you can post your question there. We will wait until the end to take questions, and then we allow up to an hour to answer questions. And I think probably we'll have enough time to do that today. Early on, when we had a zillion attendees, then we didn't have enough time to get through all of them. If you're watching in YouTube, be aware the chat is running there. Please keep it on topic to what's being discussed here, because this will be saved onto YouTube, and sometimes those chats save in there also. So please keep it on topic. And if you have a question, we have some chat room moderators, and Owly Keep is Tristan Williams from the Scottish Owl Center, and he may be able to answer some within chat anyway, or otherwise funnel them over to me to ask Lauren in the Q&A session at the end. So that's kind of how we have things running. Okay, so a little bit about Lauren. She has a BS in biology from Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, and an MS in applied animal behavior and welfare from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. She's worked in labs, in veterinary settings, animal rescues, and zoos. She worked on the initial setup of the breeding program for the northern spotted owls in British Columbia, and volunteered for the Burrowing Owl Conservation Society of British Columbia, and led the setup of their third facility in 2011, and became the executive director in 2016. So Lauren, take it away.
Oh, okay. Hi, everybody. So yeah, thanks, Carla, for inviting me. I think I'm going to be like the third burrowing owl speaker. So burrowing owls are pretty popular, and you'll probably see why. They're pretty cool little birds. So I have a presentation, so I guess I'll get started with that. Yeah, so this is sort of a long title, but it's kind of looking at the burrowing owl captive propagation and conservation of the Western burrowing owls, to be specific. And that's in British Columbia up in Canada. So if you don't know where that is, don't worry, I'll show you some maps so you can kind of pinpoint it if they're you. From 1983 till now. A little bit about myself. So a lot of people probably who do the owl stuff are like, when I was a child, I saw an owl and then I became an owl person. Well, I kind of came to owls a little bit circular. I just love animals, and I was interested in all kinds of animals. I really wanted to be a zookeeper when I grew up. I did some volunteering. You can see here with a tiger. Some of you guys know about Tiger King. I actually did an internship with Carol Baskin at Big Cat Rescue in 2005. So before all the Tiger King weirdness, but it was a really cool experience. I loved big cats, so that was great. And then I worked at a zoo. I worked with all kinds of things like lemurs and birds and other big cats, African wild dogs, and that was really awesome too. And then when I was working, when I did my master's at the University of Edinburgh, I really started to work with some owls and some other kinds of birds. And so I got to do some work at the Edinburgh Zoo. And here's a barn owl here. And I was looking actually at bird personality and looking at how their bird personality would relate to trainability. And then also I have lots of friends who do work with different animals. So this is actually frogs. So just taking pictures of tadpoles. So yeah, so I did all of that. And then at this one zoo that I was working at that Carla said, I got involved with the Northern Spotted Owl program. And that started in sort of 2007 at the zoo I was working at. And through that, I actually went to a breeding birds in captivity conference, and I got to know the burrowing owl people. And I was like, these guys are really cool. These birds are really neat. And basically since then I've become like an owl crazy person. So I just love owls. And I kind of almost think of them as the big cats of the sky, you know? So, so this is where I spend my summers now, out in the field. So weighing some burrowing owls. I take our burrowing owl for different education purposes. Before the pandemic, we actually have a winery up here in BC called the Burrowing Owl Winery. And all of their tasting fees actually come to our conservation society, and they also fund a lot of other environmental programs. I would go to the winery maybe like 4 times a year just to show people like burrowing owl actually is an owl, and that it's endangered. So which was great because you would hit all kinds of people, like sort of people that aren't in the know of biology, which was really cool. And the winery is actually quite famous here, so a lot of people didn't even know that was real owl. So, and again, there's just doing that. So that's kind of my background. So it was more of that captive breeding and captive management. So this program really worked well for me because it was a combination of that wild conservation, but also captive propagation. So I said I would look at the map. So here's a map of the world with all of the grasslands. So what makes burrowing owls really unique is that they inhabit the grasslands. So you can see there's grasslands across the world, and they are they're one of the most endangered ecosystems around. And then if we focus in on North America, we've got some different grassland types. And so if you kind of look down here, we're sort of in this temperate desert. And a lot of people are like, what, we live in Canada, and yes, there is a desert, and we live in the only true desert in Canada. And so it's a very unique ecosystem where we live, and that's where the burrowing owls live in BC. In the rest of Canada, the burrowing owls live in more of the prairie type of grassland. So this is a different type of grassland. And this is a range map. It's kind of been around for a while, sort of on burrowing owls. You can see that it has declined, and it's even declined further than that. Still trying to do some other numbers, but you can see in Canada that basically in British Columbia, they're gone. There were a smaller population, but it was birds kind of coming up probably from Washington and Oregon. Alberta and Saskatchewan still have some wild populations of owls, even though they're dwindling. And Manitoba as well has a program that's starting to, they breed owls in captivity and release them as well. Alberta has just started, in the last few years, a head starting program. So what they do is they bring wild young owls in, keep them over the winter, and release them. So that might be something they might start doing in Saskatchewan as well. But at least they have still a wild population. So we're trying to work together to try and still preserve that. And again, even closer in range. So just kind of looking just into Canada. Again, you can see that it has really retracted down into most southern portions of Canada. So I live just right here. Can you see my cursor there? Just a little bit below Kelowna. So we actually release the owls between sort of this area around Kamloops and then south of Kelowna down to the border. So a little bit on the status of burrowing owls in Canada. Their common name, burrowing owl, Athene cunicularia. They are endangered or red listed here. So they're found in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. And every so often they're reevaluating their population, designated threatened in the 70s. Then each kind of reiteration, it's still endangered, still not doing well. Sorry, let me just move this thing here. So again, we were showing that big map of the grasslands. So there it is becoming quite endangered. And especially in Canada and probably in other parts of the States, is like grasslands are generally thought of like, well, there are no trees, so we can develop this or use it for agriculture. It's a lot easier. But in fact, we're wrecking a whole ecosystem, even though we're not cutting down necessarily any trees. And this is a very unique biodiversity within these grasslands that needs to be preserved. And by sort of developing it and having agriculture, we're not only affecting, say, burrowing owls, but other animals and other plants as well. And it's been really hard. As you can see, the Canadian population was reduced by 90% from 1990 to 2000, and then another 60% up to 2015. So like I said, again, is most of the remaining wild individuals are still in Alberta and Saskatchewan, even though dwindling. I know Jeff Holroyd did a presentation on burrowing owls as well, especially in Saskatchewan and Alberta, and definitely their populations are not what they were. And they have been pretty much extirpated in BC since the 80s and kind of extirpated in Manitoba as well. So a lot of people ask, well, why? Why are they declining? They're also declining in the United States, but they're not, it depends on each state. Definitely in Florida, they're endangered. They're a little bit of a different species. But the Western Burrowing Owl, they're doing quite a few surveys, and we're working with people in Washington and Oregon, and they might be doing some more recent, they're hoping to do some more recent surveys, but the thought is that they are declining even further from their last counts, which was in the early 2000s. So again, loss of grassland habitat. And even though in where we live, maybe the habitat loss isn't as great, but the change in what the habitat looks like, and I'll kind of explain that a little bit later, is that it's not sort of the same grassland that was maybe in the 1800s. It's a very different grassland. We also have a huge cattle industry here in the grasslands too, which can benefit, but also hinder the owls. So there's sort of a double-edged sword there. The other thing is, well, as probably a lot of you guys know, burrowing owls live in burrows underground. They're the only owl that actually nests underground. And what they need are burrows. And so burrows built by other animals. And we know a lot of owls, they prefer to just take over nests from other animals, right? They're pretty smart. I would think that way. Don't build your own house, just remodel it, right? So in BC, generally it would have been badgers, maybe some ground squirrels, and coyotes. But unfortunately, badgers are also endangered in BC. And they've been pretty persecuted, especially by the agricultural industry, probably from misinformation. As well, badgers can be predators to the burrowing owls. So we prefer if they just go and dig a bunch of holes and then leave. So, you know. In addition, reduction in prey populations. So whether that be rodents or insects for burrowing owls. So burrowing owls eat a variety of food. They eat small rodents, and that sort of changes in each area that they live in. Here, it's generally deer mice, meadow voles, pocket gophers. I know down for like David Johnson, they have like kangaroo rats and different things like that. They also eat a variety of insects, also small lizards and some small birds as well. So when I showed this, it's just showing like the grasslands, how it's changed. We've got agriculture, we've got cities. And with agriculture and cities, especially in the 60s and 70s, a huge amount of pesticide, rodenticide use, and that's still continuing. Even though some areas are cutting out rodenticides, there's still insecticides and pesticides use, and that really dwindled the rodent and also the insect populations. It also can make it hard for the owls to hunt if you've got tall agriculture, like tall grasses and things for them to hunt in. And increases in predation. I worked at a rehab place at one point, and the number one things they rehabbed were red-tailed hawks and great horned owls. And they've just done really well. So they do really well in urban settings. They do really well in sort of converted grasslands, especially with grasslands now. There's telephone poles, there's fence posts, there's more trees. So these types of birds can hang out in those and occupy those territories. They hunt on the burrowing owls. So on top of the burrowing owls, other natural predators, maybe like northern harrier hawks and other types of birds of prey, they're just getting these added ones that are just doing really well. So, and we're promoting these other animals coming into these grasslands. Also, As I'll explain later, owls are moving, they're migrating, and sometimes the only places that they have little holes that they go to tend to be culverts on the sides of roads. This is in the States, because Canada doesn't, except in maybe in Ontario, we have some highways like this, but not really up here. They're not as big as this, but they're crossing the roads at dusk and dawn, doing some hunting. They're getting hit by cars. And it's really hard to tell how many maybe die by that, just because if they get hit, they're so tiny, and then often they get picked up by a scavenging animal later on. So there might be a bit more collisions with vehicles than we know. I know up here in our area where we have released owls, we've had a couple that hit by cars. And we wouldn't have known it if somebody wasn't walking along that side of the road and found them, because they're just like so tiny. And then if you don't find them within a day, they're gone. Renewable energy source is great, of course, but it does create conflict with birds. And we have had a few burrowing owls die due to some windmills. So we're also concerned too with those big solar farms, like how is that changing, and where are they going to be putting those? Are they going to be putting them in grasslands again? And how is that changing that? So somehow we need to figure out how to work with the renewable energy with the burrowing owls and with grasslands. And again, severe weather, everybody knows about this. I think everyone, has either had drought, fire, flood at some point in any part of the world now. It doesn't seem like any of us are exempt. Here in BC, our climate is changing. It seems like we're getting huge amounts of precipitation sort of in the springtime when the owls are starting to nest. And now we're having huge fires sort of at the end of summer and then drought. So it's really sort of changing the pattern of what we have here. So I know that Troy Willicombe and some others have done some papers and we try to mitigate some of those, but it's like, if you keep getting maybe one extreme weather event, we can try and help the owls over that. But if you're getting multiple over the year and during their migration route, like how is that affecting their survivability? So the BC program, they were declared extirpated in the 1980s. There was an owl center run by Kay McKeever in Ontario that actually bred the first burrowing owls that were released way back then. And then they also grabbed some burrowing owls from Washington. And back in the 80s, we were able to trade some bighorn sheep down to Washington for some owls. And you could do that back then. You can't do that now. You need like a bajillion permits and things like that. But back then they did that for a few years, and they released these owls in burrows that they dug, and they did really well. But then once they stopped sort of releasing birds there, the population dwindled back down again. So they kind of abandoned that project in the late 80s and 90s, or 80s, early 90s. So this guy right here, Mike McIntosh, was a part of that initial program with the government. He also worked at a zoo in Vancouver, and they had a few burrowing owls there. And then when that zoo closed down, he said, well, let's try and breed them here. Let's not, instead of bringing them up from Washington, let's try and breed the birds here. Then maybe they'll be more likely to stay here. So we started with one facility in 1992, just bred 9 owls, released 9 owls. So very small. And at that point, it was really working with just a couple of ranchers, because ranchers in the area they own these bigger tracts of grassland. And that's what we could work on. In 2000, so that first little bit of time in the 90s, just breeding, starting to get the population up in the breeding facility. They were able to add another breeding facility up at the BC Wildlife Park. So their first one was actually near Vancouver, and then the next one was at the Kamloops, up in Kamloops at the Wildlife Park. And then they became an official society in 2000. They also perfected this burrow design that works in BC. There's lots of different burrow designs throughout North America, and it's sort of just depending on your program and the soil and your volunteer base, kind of how you can build them. So they had 2 breeding facilities at the time. And then because of working with that first ranchers, those first couple of ranchers, other ranchers were like, oh, this is an okay program. Because at first you had to really overcome like, hey, we're throwing some holes in your property. And that's always sort of like contentious. So you have to be like, no, these holes are safe for cattle and they're good for owls and you don't have to do anything. So from 2005 to now, we release about 100 owls a year. And then we opened up a new facility in 2011 down in Oliver. So that's in the south. We call it the Okanagan here, and it's the South Okanagan. And we use DNA as well to sex the owls because it can be really hard to tell the difference between a male and a female burrowing owl. They look pretty much the same until there's breeding season. There's a few little differences there, but so we actually take a couple little fluffy feathers from them. We used to take blood, but now we just send feathers to Wildlife Genetics in Nelson, BC. And then we also started using the soft release cage. I'll talk a little bit more about the soft release cage later. So this is just generally our life cycle of the burrowing owls in the field and in our captive facility. So in the captive facility, it's a little bit earlier. We have our founder owls. So we have owls that are either wild caught, which is very few in BC. So most of them are actually from Washington and Oregon. And then they're brought in, or they're descendants of them. And we pair them up in our facilities, and they will stay for their entire lives in the facility. So they're the ones that will have young, and then it's those young that will release into the wild. So it starts a bit earlier in our captive facility. We put them together. We find around February 14th is a nice time to pair them up because, romance. So, and once they get used to their pair, like it's nice to keep the same pair. They generally are monogamous, but if one dies, they will easily repair with another one. In April, they're going to start laying their nest, and again, about 6 to 12 eggs. And I just realized it's not 28 days. It should be like 23 to 25 days. This is an old graphic. I just saw that's wrong. And they like to crumple up cow manure or other types of manure that are there, either to put that underneath the eggs. They also like to have it at the front of their burrow, and that helps entice like other insects to come in there. If there isn't any of that kind of stuff, then they'll just lay it in the dirt in their burrow. In the field here, we generally find they're starting to lay their eggs kind of end of April, beginning of May. So beginning of May, they're starting to hatch, and then they do an asynchronous hatching because when they lay their eggs, they lay one every 1.5 days, and they don't start incubating their eggs until they've reached about half of their clutch. So generally about egg 5 or 6, they'll start incubating. And so when they hatch over a period of a few days. So that's why it's called asynchronous hatching, and because they have different incubation periods. In June and July and August, sort of depending on when they've hatched, we will throw some bands on them. And the nice thing about burrowing owls is we can catch them in their burrows. And we have this thing called a plunger, which is, it's got a foamy bit on the end, and we just kind of push it down the tunnel, and it gets them down to the end of the artificial burrow, and then we can grab them out. So, and we do this before they start flying. Once they're flying, it's just like, it's pretty hard to catch them, but it is nice that we can, that's a great thing. We don't need like a mist net or anything like that, or big nets or whatever. So we don't have to go on ladders and stuff. And then again, the separate thing up here is that the owls that were born the previous year, so our owls that were born, so this year in 2022, that were born in our facility, we'll be releasing them next year, so in 2024. And then, so we keep the young that were born to our founders for 1 entire year. And again, these are our 3 captive facilities. So you can see they're open air. We live in BC. It doesn't, sort of the southern part of BC, it's not as cold here as other parts of Canada, except for, of course, the last 2 years, it's gotten a little bit chillier. But generally, it's fine here. We don't need to have like special inside facilities for them. We've got deep burrows, we've got insulated burrows for them, and heated mats for their food. But we like to have this open air sort of format is because then they also have like they can see predators flying overhead. If bugs or things get in, they can get access to that. And again, our original owls are from Washington and Oregon. And we do have a stud bookkeeper, so somebody that keeps track of the genetics so that we're not breeding brother and sister and things like that. So again, our release sites, mostly with private ranchers. We do also work with the provincial and federal government here. And in the last few years, we've really kind of focused our effort on working with some larger conservancy groups. So the Nature Conservancy of Canada, they buy up huge tracts of land. So here in the Okanagan, they're buying up grasslands. We also have an organization called the Nature Trust of BC. And then we're working with a couple of local Indigenous groups, so the Upper Nicola Band and the Penticton Indian Band. And you can see when we go out into the site, there are a bunch of burrows out here, but you can't even tell that they're there. And then here you can see the cattle, they're kind of standing around. This is a bit of an entrance of a burrow. We do kind of put rocks and sticks around to kind of mostly keep the cattle away. But they do really well with cattle there. So we've kind of made the burrows sort of slightly cattle proof. Sometimes they wreck our burrows. And then this is the Operation Burrowing Owl. That's this plaque sort of originated in Saskatchewan. They were the first ones to really perfect that stewardship and working with burrowing owls. So they gave us some of those signs. So some of those we've been able to give some to some of the landowners that want to display them. And so here's our burrows, our take on the burrow. So we have a 10-foot long pipe here. And I know you're like, why are you saying in feet? Because you're in Canada, but Canada, we mix up everything. We do metric and then whatever, imperial all at once. So, and this is where the owls access it. And then this is where we access it. So we have a large inverted bucket here and then a 2-bucket system on top. This one's full of dirt. And then on the top, we actually will have a lid and then a rock on there, and you can't really tell. So we don't have to dig it up every time. We just remove the lid and then open that up. Yeah, so this is our burrows. Some places have like 2 entrances. We just find one entrance is good for us right now, just because sometimes there's just one of us going out. And if you're plunging one side, it's safest for the owls if you're just going in, if there's just one of you going in. If we had multiple, if we were a bigger organization, maybe I would have 2 exits for the owls. And we might even be doing some other trials of some different kinds of burrows later on. But so far, this is generally what the burrows look like. And we put them into groups of 2 to 3, just so that there's other entrances, especially when the young are getting a bit older and they want to come out. They have other burrows to go into that are close by. So before 2005, anytime the Burrowing Owl Society released owls, they just released them into the burrows. They blocked them in there for a day or 2 and then let them out, and they were gone. And some stayed, but a lot left. So they were like, well, how can we get them to stay longer? Amy Mitchell worked a lot with Courtney Conway down in the States, and used this kind of technique with a lot of other birds as well. And you can call it a hacking cage, or this is our soft release system. And some places can put in big soft release systems because they can drive right up and drop them off. Sometimes some of our sites are 1 kilometer or 2 away and we have to walk in. So we have it's sort of like a little tent that we can erect, and it nails into the ground. And so we put the owls in there and we will feed them in there, and usually for a couple of weeks until they've laid about half of their clutch. And so since we've installed these, our survivability has increased. This is just us feeding in the cages. So I did talk through that because Carla said if I talk, it gets a little garbly. But so that's our soft release cage. So it's very technical. We've got a string there that we tie up and then we open it and that's where we feed them. So we're feeding them a combination of mice and day-old chicks. As once the cage comes off, we're still going to be supplement feeding. So that's a big part of our program is supplement feeding the owls that we've released from our captive breeding facilities. Because they haven't been out in the wild, we're trying to give them a boost, right? So they haven't done as much hunting. But then once the cage comes off, they're able to hunt, but we'll still be providing some food for them as well.
Buttons 498 releasing male.
And that is our release. So when a lot of people are like, I want to come to the owl release. And I'm like, well, we just take them out of one crate and we put them in a hole. So it's not super exciting. The best, I always tell people if they want to come out, to come when we ban the young owls in the field. So it's a little bit different than other bird kind of releases. So that's us putting them in the hole. And then that previous one is when we feed them right. So that rock that's in front, that's only there just for we leave them in the burrow for a couple of nights, just because when we pair them up, they've met their new partner just like the day before. And so we want them to kind of like settle down in there. We give them a bunch of food in there. And the nice thing about owls is they actually burrowing owls, they do really well in those crates and stuff, just because that being in a burrow is sort of safe and happy for them. And now the next video, just sort of some comedy. So you'll notice is that sometimes with our soft release cages, we actually put electric fencing around it because we're often in ranch land. We get cattle that are interested in it and they want to rub on the cage and they sometimes squish it. In the last couple of years, we've had coyotes come right up to the cages and like bite, take the mesh. So this last year, we've actually increased our electric fencing. We've got 3 wires now, but this is a video from before. And the guy touching the electric fence is actually a provincial biologist. So I just think it's really funny that he did that. So the guy that really got the shock there, that's the provincial biologist. The other guy is our volunteer. And I was like, yeah. And I was like, I know it's on, you don't need to touch it, but like somehow they want to touch it. And then you can see there's our little plunger there on the ground. So this is some of Amy's results. So this was she did a lot of this work in 2005 and 6. So showing the difference between hard release, so that's just putting them in the burrows, as opposed to the soft release, so having them in the cage. And so you can see that generally by 50%, it's much better. So it's the adults are staying, they're surviving the breeding season, they're actually initiating clutches, they have more hatched chicks, and they fledge more young. So the soft release cages, even though they're a lot of work, they're super beneficial. What we want to do is get as many owls out there as possible, wild ones. And again, the supplemental feeding. So this is a wild owl's food cache. So when they come back from migration, generally the male is going to hunt as much as possible, stuff his burrows to entice this female. And what we want to do with the ones that we're releasing is we want to sort of mimic that. So give them a bunch of food. So it's like the male's like, oh, here's all this food here. And we also, once the young have hatched, we want to increase that amount of food that we've given as well. And Troy did a study in 1997 that showed that the benefits of doing that supplemental feeding after the young have hatched is greatly increased. And also, I believe in the talk that Jeff Holroyd did as well, he's doing even some more work on that about how supplemental feeding is helping. So you can see a nice plate of mice. That's we get those from the Mouse Man in Alberta. They're very expensive. So we feed sort of, we would love to feed just mice, but we can't afford it. They're like $1.30 Canadian, which I don't know is like 100 American or something. I don't know. But And then we also feed, I didn't show it, but like Dale chicks, because sometimes people don't like to see that, but they're a lot cheaper for us. However, with avian flu and all of this, they're becoming a little bit scarcer to get. So, but the owls do prefer the mice. And so you can see this is one of our captive owls eating the mice. And a lot of people are like, oh, they'll go for like the dead ones. The nice thing with burrowing owls too is like they love to food cache. So even if they don't eat the dead one, they're going to store them for later. But if like a wild mouse gets in, they're going to go for that first. So really this food is supplemental to their wild food, right? So we want them hunting wild stuff, but in case they can't get it or they have some missed opportunities because they're not as good at hunting yet, they've got this other food. Now, so to skip along a little bit, so when I was talking about the asynchronous hatching, so with our program as well, sometimes, because we're supplement feeding, their clutches can be quite large because the owls are like, oh, hey, we've got lots of food, we're doing well. So they can have 6 to 12 young, generally, probably around 8 or 9 is average here in BC. And so when they first hatch, those first ones are really big. By the time you get to day 3, the last ones to hatch are really tiny. And often they just can't get to the food in the wild, or they get stomped on by their siblings. Now, if we're able to get to them in time, and if we find a loth, so a last one to hatch, we will bring it in and we'll give it some food. And sometimes those actually become our education owls too, because we've maybe handled them too much. I always tell people, like I did my master's, and now I'm like cutting up, this is mice, just cut up really small. And we first call it, so Dawn Brody, one of our biologists, she called it mouse mash. And then we would make it chunkier and we call it mouse salsa, and then make it until they were a little bit older. So we get them at this young and they're often like flat, and you could tell they don't have a lot of food in their belly. So we'll bring them in, and then we can feed them. And the nice thing about burrowing owls too is they're really hard to imprint. Like you have to spend a ton of time with them. So we just go in, we feed them, and then we can put them back in any burrow as long as the siblings are the same age. So we'll ban them so we know which burrow they're from originally, but it seems like the parents are not going to care if they have 7 young or 8 young once they get to a certain age. And we have had loths like migrate and come back and survive. So we know that it works. And then this is some of them we would do some weighing and measuring as they got a little bit older. And again, you can see this was one of our education owls, but these are a whole bunch of loths that we had. This was my first education owl was Pilot. And these guys, and then these all got released back out. So sometimes we get lots of loths, sometimes we don't get any, just depends on the year. But that's kind of a fun part of the job. And then of course with bands, we put on a green over black band, and that's specific to BC. So other states and provinces have different colored bands. Some forgo those and just do the US Fish and Wildlife bands, the silver ones with the long serial number. These are the old ones with the tabs. Now we just have the butt end ones, so they don't have the little tabs on them. These ones are just really hard to see. Like if somebody has a camera, it's much easier to see this. So you pretty much have to get the bird in hand to get that serial number. So this is nice. So when we get reports from other parts in the States and they say, oh, I see a green over black band, we're like, okay, it's probably us. And then this is our very technical little towel that we wrap the owls in, and we call it our burrowing owl burrito. So sometimes you put out, birds in bags and things like that, but we just do this little towel thing. And then we can just put them on a little jewelry scale that only goes up to 250 grams, but burrowing owls generally weigh probably 150 to 200. So with most of them being around 170, 180 in the wild. And then, yes, when it's rainy or sunny, I get some of the volunteers to put an umbrella over me. So this is our number of wild juveniles produced per owl. So that's released plus recruited. So owls that have returned. And so you can see generally we had upward trend. And then this is just like using the soft soft release cages. Unfortunately, 2020, we didn't use soft release cages. Pandemic year, we had a lot of issues with volunteers. And I was also on mat leave, so that didn't super help. And so for migration, this is something a lot of people have been working on the last few years. We did try geolocators. So they're little backpacks that go in the owls, and they just record light and dark cycles, but you have to get the unit back. And the problem is we haven't had a huge return rate. So we put 11 on ours and we didn't get it. We got one back, but it was an owl that didn't migrate. So, and then these are just general sightings. So people who've sent us messages, other biologists. So, and this is from the beginning. So from the 90s to now, I have a few more on there as well. So generally the BC owls we are seeing, they're sort of heading to the coast and heading down into California, Mexico. So a little bit of a different route than say the ones in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. The next thing is the PTTs, which are the platform terminal transmitters. So that's these here. They give much more accurate locations and you don't need the owl back. The nice thing about our facility is we're the largest breeders of burrowing owls in the world. So we were actually able to test these units before we deployed them on wild owls. And then they were able to develop this little lift kit because the owl feathers were just covering the solar panel the whole time. And then we also wanted to make sure the antenna was okay because, the owls are going in and out of burrows. And I also put it on one of our education owl because he tends to pick at everything. So that was good. So even though we tested them, we're like, we couldn't afford to put them on our owls because they're like $5,000 each. But this is just a small map from David Johnson with some of the PTT work they've done. Troy and Courtney Conway have much better maps and they've done so much more. And even Troy was able to give me a used PTT. And we had one on a female here and she went from here to here. So she didn't go very far. So we're like, is that migration or just going to the coast? But it is interesting. I just love this graphic because it's like, where the heck is this owl going? Generally, a lot of them are going down this middle part and heading into Mexico. And then over here from our sighting data is that a lot of them are going to the coast. What's really exciting in the last 6 months is working a lot with Washington and Oregon and more with Troy is that we're hoping to do sort of a study with BC, Washington, and Oregon and putting transmitters on owls in all three, so in the 2 states and the province, because we're sort of like this one geographical sort of similar area and looking at that migration route. So that hopefully in the next couple of years, if Carla has me back, I might have some more information, which would be really cool. This is just a thing of like how many owls we've released since the 90s. So we've released over 2,000. They've produced close to 3,000 owls. We've had about 400 owls return, but which is actually a really good return rate. It's just not sustainable yet. Like if we stopped releasing the owls, that's probably, we're just not getting everything yet. Again, this is how many wild born out in the field. So you can see it kind of goes cyclical. It's gone a bit down the last couple of years. And then our returns, we had such a great return year in 2015, 2016, we had like 50 return, but then it's crashed back down again. And then this is just generally how much we release. If it's gone down a little bit, it's just because some of our breeders in our facilities are getting older. Generally, when they hit about 8, they're not as good at production. So owls in the wild live maybe 4 to 6 years. Some of the oldest ones were 9 or 10. In captivity, we had one live to 15, but he was like really old. But we find with their breeding, generally around 8, then they drop off. And then I have this little video here. You don't really need to see the sound, but just watch what the owl is doing. So you probably know, well, he obviously noticed the camera quite a bit, but you can notice that he was really trimming the grass there. So I just wanted to show, so we hadn't gotten to this burrow yet, but we generally try and weed whack around the front of the burrow or the apron of the burrow to keep that clear. The problem is a lot of our grasslands, if they don't have cattle on them, or they used to have cattle, is that they have a lot of sort of non-native grasses. And once you take the cattle off, or maybe they're not there for a few months, the grasses are getting super tall. So they can get, like, this isn't even that tall, but the owls like can't hunt in that. They can't see predators. And we're finding this is another problem. I mean, this is a huge problem. It's not, we're starting to discover like it's not limiting. I don't think burrowing owl survival is limited by burrows. There's quite a lot of burrows. We've dug probably over 1,000 since the early 90s. I monitor about 500 a year. There's a ton of burrows out there and they're in good condition. But the grasses, and especially this last couple of years, we've seen a real dip in how many young are around. Is actually some of the sites that they don't have cattle on anymore. The grasses are really tall. Again, they can't hunt. There may be rodents there, but they're not accessible. So we're going to do some more studies on sort of rodent and insect prey availability for the owls. We can do some weed whacking, but it's hard to keep up with that. I'm the only full-time staff for our society, and then I can hire a couple of seasonal staff in the summer with some of our money. So even though seems like a large program, it's not really that big. So I really want to work with other groups, and that's the same across Canada. Like none of the burrowing owl stuff is very large, but really we need to look at that habitat, and is it sort of the best habitat for burrowing owls? And if it's not great for burrowing owls, it's probably not great for other animals as well. But to end on a good note, this is a volunteer-based community organization, and burrowing owls are such lovely birds that people just want to be with them. They want to help them. So I have tons of great volunteers, and all of the burrows we put in are hand dug. We are not able to bring any machines onto the grassland. So when you see other programs, just remember they probably had somebody dig that with a backhoe or something. Ours are all hand dug, and it's very rocky here. As you can see, we've got some big rocky mountains around. And then another great thing is I can take our owl to schools and work with the ranchers here. We had a great volunteer that actually made this beautiful diorama for me that I can take apart and take it to schools. And we actually had some young, unfortunately, birds, so we taxidermied all of those. So they're like 20 years old though, these birds. So they're really good condition. Yes, and and I didn't bring him today, but this is Pluto, our education owl, and he's 7 and he'll be 8 next year. And you can see he's got a little bit of snow on the ground, and this is his burrow. He's got 4 burrows in a giant pen. But you can see they can really flip off their feathers because people are like, are they okay in the winter? And I'm like, as long as they've got a warm burrow and food, they're fine. And, those feathers are great insulators. And then he wears jesses and anklets when he goes out to presentations, though he hasn't gone out to too many the last few years, but we took him one a few days ago and he did really well. So just want to thank all of our supporters and the Burrowing Owl Winery and the Kamloops Wildlife Park especially. And we only get one government grant right now. We used to get quite a few. But our federal government has sort of changed what they want to fund, unfortunately. So, and then we have a really awesome website, which we're always trying to update. So if you want to donate, you can donate online through Canada Helps. With that, you can also send us just by the snail mail as well. Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks to Carla and the International Owl Center for inviting me. And I'm hoping that I can come to the owl conference next year. Because I'd love to visit and get to know about owl vocalizations and all that other fun stuff. So thanks very much. And I'll stop sharing my screen now, I guess. Is that good? Okay. That was a lot of information and I didn't say everything, but you get the gist. So
That's the thing with owls. There's always so much to say.
I could talk forever.
Yeah. So when you come for the owl conference, so Lauren was mentioning, and I was going to mention also, we're doing a World Owl Conference in La Crosse, Wisconsin, October 23rd to 27th, 2023. So if you're interested in learning boatloads of owl research, plan on coming, and we'll have some pre-conference workshops, post-conference field trips. The website is worldowlconference.com. And there's a Facebook page you can follow also, World Owl Conferences, because that one will be for all future conferences too. So that's meant to be like the scientific stuff. So this kind of on steroids. So if you want to geek out on all the scientific stuff and meet a whole bunch of people that you've met in the Virtual Owl Expert Speaker Series, you can plan to come for that. We don't have registration open yet. We're hoping to have that open by the beginning of the year. So we're doing some final stuff with pricing, food prices. We're still working out bus prices, registration deadlines, but we're hoping to have that live by the beginning of the year. So Joe, do you want to start with a question for Lauren?
Yes, if I can unmute myself. So this person says, I caretake an education permitted burrowing owl. He seems to prefer eating bugs during the day and a mouse at night. How would you know that this is a general characteristic or an individual preference?
Yeah, I mean, it could be an individual preference. I know that the owls in our facility, like our education owl, I give them the bugs as like a treat. So I'll give them crickets, dead crickets, otherwise they just get away. So as a treat, so they like that, but they, like I know with some studies and stuff, even though they eat lots of insects, the biomass that they've ingested is mostly rodents. So they're mostly rodents and then sort of topping it up with insects. So it could be this individual owl's preference. It also depends on age too. I think when they're younger, when they're really little, they kind of love going for the bugs because it's easier to catch. So yeah, I mean, our owls, I mostly feed them mice and Dale chicks, and they sort of just eat the heads off the Dale chicks. They'll eat those sort of at the end, but they go for the mice first. So it could be a preference for the insects. So yeah, but that's cool. Where are you? I wonder where they're from.
Maybe that person can post back where they're from.
Yeah.
I'm pulling one over from YouTube. Somebody is wondering if the burrows are all mapped out and listed. All the burrows out.
Yes, so they're all GPSed and mapped out. We just don't have them public because they're on a lot of private ranch land. So that's only privy to us and the government. So yeah.
Another one, is there, I'm probably going to butcher the name of this. Is there still a population at Guichon Ranch?
Guichon.
Guichon? I visited there many years ago and when they were still released there.
Yeah, we still release there. So Judy Guichon has sold that ranch recently. So there's new owners. So I'm just trying to get a hold of them to see what we can do. But that's where we originally released the bulk of the owls to begin with. So there was a spot in Kamloops called Lac du Bois, which is a provincial site, and then Guichon's, which was pretty much the first rancher. Yeah, so they're great supporters of the birds, and yeah, we still release them there. So.
And the previous commenter says they live in New Mexico and they like live mealworms for making friends and training.
Yes, that's yes, if you can get them something special so that they'll like come to you. I just found, I don't know, Tristan probably at the Owl Center is better at training. Like for us, we just, as long as they'll sit on a glove to go for education, that's great. I don't really spend a ton of time doing training with them, but yeah, if you can find a treat, that's great. So.
Another question from YouTube. Are you planning to have any live cam setups?
We used to actually have some at one of our breeding facilities. Unfortunately, the Wi-Fi is just really terrible. Now, like the old one, it was hardwired in, but we're not able to do that anymore. And we do have cameras and stuff we set up with the Kamloops Wildlife Park. It's just they're trying to boost the Wi-Fi up to the breeding facility. It's a little bit out of the reach. But if we go to the Kamloops Wildlife Park website, which I can probably send you guys, they do have some live footage, well, sort of replayed footage of it. So yeah.
Do you find that farmers and ranchers are generally accepting of burrowing owls on their properties, or are there conflicts?
So generally now they are. Like I get people wanting burrowing owls there. I would say in the 90s it was a bit of a harder push, but now they really like that, and also they like working with us. We're not a government agency, we're a nonprofit, so it's just a handshake. We don't have a formal agreement with them. So if something happens and they move, or we have to take burrows out, sometimes we have to do that, which is unfortunate, but they do generally want to have the burrows there and the owls there. They really like that. So especially when they know how many rodents and insects they eat as well. So
how do the released owls know how to search for food?
Yeah, so I get that a lot. And I feel like, I kind of do know that burrowing owls, they're kind of like cats, right? They know how to hunt, even though they're fed, they know how to hunt, they know what to go for. And again, our breeding facilities as well, sort of open air. Sometimes some rodents get in there, insects get in there all the time, and they definitely will hunt those first, even before the food that we give them. We have tried live training in the past, and I know a few other places do that, but live training doesn't seem to model the actual live thing, because you're putting them in a container. And then I find too, the mice generally get out of the container before the owl figures out how to get in the container and hunt it. And again, that's why the soft release cages are so helpful, because we put the owls that are inexperienced in there, and we're still supplement feeding them. So even if they don't catch anything, they still have some food. And then when the cages come off, we'll check their pellets as well to see, are they switching over to wild prey? So the nice thing is we feed a lot of white mice. It is better probably if you fed them different colored mice, so they get to see that. But for us, we got white mice and yellow chicks. So when you look at your pellet, it's kind of white and yellow, and you're like, okay, they're still eating that. But then when it goes brown, darker brown, you're like, okay, they're hunting wild prey, and you see the insects in there as well. So we know that they're eating it. And really, like, I kind of say, like, the owls that we release, they're young are experts now at hunting and catching things. And those are really the ones that we expect will migrate and come back, because those are the true wild owls. So, and again, we don't really hand raise a lot of the owls that we don't really hand raise any of them that we release, unless we give a little bit, like when they're the loss. But having the parent reared ones, they can communicate different things that we can't on how to hunt and stuff. So we've just found that the soft release cages is the best, and that's probably not the limiting factor of why, if they don't survive. So, and again, we do the supplement feeding. So yeah.
This is a two-part question. This person works with education raptors and is interested in your research on how bird personalities affect trainability. And have you found seasonal changes in how training progresses?
Seasonal changes. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, because generally when we get the young, they're born sort of in the springtime. And then I would think if you got one sort of during breeding season, sort of early spring, that might be a bit harder. So my research with bird personality, it's sort of like, I didn't come to any sort of real super duper conclusions, but there are some birds that do better with people than others. And we've had that in the past, where we've had, like, for Pluto, actually, and even with Pilot, we each had like two birds kind of around the same time. And we were kind of like, which one's better? And definitely, like, Pluto was more come up to me. We had another one named Pip, and she just was like, no, she wouldn't come to you or anything. And so we kind of we actually put her in the breeding program was better. We also had another owl once that one of our other biologists raised, and then her boyfriend, like after a year or two, like it started attacking her boyfriend, and then just became very not trainable anymore. So the nice thing is we can just put them in our breeding program if they don't work out as education birds. But I do find that, yeah, you need to spend a lot of time with the burrowing owls and work with them quite a bit compared to other birds. They don't imprint as easily, which is nice. Like we don't have to wear silly costumes when we're feeding the young ones if we want to keep them wild. But definitely, like, you have to spend a ton of time with them, and then with a variety of people as well, because they will sort of just kind of go for one person. Though Pluto now in the last few years is better with sitting with other people, but only the ones that have come in and fed him. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answers the question, but and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's male or female. Like I sent two young birds that I had started raising, one to Manitoba and one to Saskatchewan, and the female in Manitoba is doing really well, and the one in Saskatchewan is still kind of like, I don't really like people, and as a boy, because generally we've had males mostly, because we find that the last ones to hatch has been typically males, so that ends up to being the kind of the ones that we have, but doesn't seem to matter the sex per se. But I would think during breeding season it might be a little bit harder, or they might get too imprinted, or not imprinted but more into you. I know that when Pluto was younger, he would sometimes jump on my hand and kind of really like my hand for a little bit. And I was like, ooh. So that could be good or bad. But yeah.
Would it be feasible to grow and harvest your own mice, whether in British Columbia or for the Owl Center in Minnesota, to feed the owls?
So you could, and a lot of people ask me that because they're like, you save so much money. And I'm like, well, not really, because each owl needs 2 prey items a day. And we've got 3 breeding facilities, and each facility houses between 30 to 50 owls every day. So we have to feed those owls. And then if we're feeding ones in the wild, if we're releasing about 100, we need to feed that. So we end up spending about $30,000 on mice. If we had to breed that amount, I'd have to build a facility. I'd have to get full-time staff. I'd have to deal with that. And I do have experience breeding mice. I worked in labs and other zoos and stuff. And if you just need it for one bird, you can kind of do it. But to have the scale, like I order 5,000 mice at a time when I can. So it's not really super feasible for us to breed. And then I got to look after another animal and then I got to put them down. I've done enough of that. I don't want to put things down. So, but the rehab center, we share a site with a rehab center. They breed some rats, but they may only have 1 bird in or 2 birds. So it's a little bit easier that way. But when you have like a certain, like right now we've got like 33 owls in our facility right now. So I couldn't keep up with that as well. But if you're willing to come and start, that's a great way to make money. You'd be a mouse rearer or a cricket rancher. So yeah.
Carla, did you want to address that about the our situation, or just leave it?
Yeah, well, we only have 7 live owls, but most of them are on rats because they're larger ones. So just the screech owl and the burrowing owl are on mice. But it also stinks quite a lot when you're raising mice and rats also. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're quite busy enough doing everything we're doing, and you would need dedicated space for that, and dedicated staff or very dedicated volunteers. So not somewhere we want to go either.
Yeah, and that ends up happening at the rehab place. Even if there's no birds there, they have to look after the rats. And you want to have, and because I worked in animal welfare too, I want to have a high standard for the rats and the mice. Like, they're living creatures too, and you got to make sure they have a good life and they eat good food and stuff as well. So the other person that we get it from, he does a great job like raising them, and we know that they are nutritionally good for our birds as well. So that's also a big a big bonus too. So it's something we always talk about, but then at the end we're like, oh, I don't think we could afford it. So actually.
How is the collaboration between your organization and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife with the CITES regulations?
So do you mean like, so we got a few wild burrowing owls back in 2012. So we were able to do some permitting that way. It still takes a long time. It takes a couple of years to get all the permitting with that, but we're probably not going to get any more birds from the States anymore, which is fine. But I do know a few more of the people down in Washington. So if we do have to do anything, like if we need to, maybe some of our captive birds, if we want to release some down there or something like that, they said that they could probably help with that. So I've had to do a few other CITES things we sent in some blood and feathers to a project down in California. San Jose was looking at the genomics of burrowing owls as well, which was really cool. So they got samples from all over North America just to see how closely related they were. They would actually be really cool to have on your thing there, Carla, too, to talk about their work with burrowing owls. So doesn't matter. Permits just take a long time. Not a long time to write, but like just that you send them off and then you don't hear for like 6 months. But generally it's like, we'll usually get it okay, because it's not, I think in the States too, like it's not, burrowing owls are not as highly, like, as they haven't federally listed them as endangered. So maybe it's a little bit easier.
Depends on the state. So for
Depends on the state, yeah.
Minnesota, they're listed as endangered.
Yeah.
So to get our education bird, we had to have a state endangered permit.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, depends on which state you're in. We just imported a dead hawk owl from Jim Duncan in Canada.
Yeah.
So
That's cool.
Yeah, always a little bit of drama because nobody knew what all permits we needed. So it was that was exciting.
Yeah, that was the first time I went to go down to take, because I actually live like an hour away from the border, so I could drive it across. But then, yeah, if they don't know what it is, that's also the problem, is like these things are not usual. So it's not on people's radar. So that can take a bit of time, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I literally got different answers from every single person in U.S. Fish and Wildlife that I talked to.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Another question. How do you keep Pluto's underground burrow clean?
Well, we check it every day. I've got a great group of volunteers and we check them all the time. They are solid underneath as well. So we add sort of a dirt peat moss mixture. So it kind of keeps it dry and clean. And then we'll just go in and take out stuff. Like he might throw up a couple of pellets in there, but he's not really pooping in there. And then if he has some mice or things he hasn't eaten, we'll take those out. So in the field, we're not really doing that. We're kind of cleaning them out once a year. But in the facility, the burrows are set up differently than the ones in the field. They're not as deep. The tubing is not as long, so we can keep that clear. And it's a little bit of an easier access to kind of keep it clean. And then about 3 times a year, we like empty out the entire burrow and replace it with new stuff. So yeah.
Have you tried doing sexing with PCR tests in the wild? This person says they know Manitoba does it.
Yeah, so Manitoba does it and Alberta does it. Because they need to know, like if they've taken young from the wild, they want to make sure they have a good sex ratio, which when they bring in. So Alberta does, so they'll bring some birds in, they'll do the PCR test, and then they can put back ones that they don't want and keep the ones that they do. Cause like, you don't want to end up with like all females or all males, right? They needed a good pairing. So when they release them, for us, we don't do any of the wild, like when they have young in the wild, we don't care if they're male or female. If they come back from migration, you can kind of tell just based on behavior. We're only sexing our owls in captivity, the ones that we're going to release, because we want to make sure we pair them up male and female. It has happened where the sexing hasn't been great, and like you put 2 males together and usually one kills one, the other. If you put 2 females in there, that just nothing happens. So And the PCR testing, I was looking at that, like doing it ourselves, but in order to have all the chemicals and all that kind of stuff, it ends up being more expensive and more trouble than us sending it to, I just take a couple of feathers, send it to this genetics, and they do $20 per bird. And it's accurate, and they do a really good job. And we don't need it on a rush scale. Like if I needed to go out in the field and I needed to know who was who, I would do that. And also Alberta and Saskatchewan, or Alberta and Manitoba are doing maybe like 20 birds, whereas we're doing about 100. So it's a little bit easier. I talked to Graham in Alberta about doing that. I was like, oh, I'd love to do that myself. And he's like, it's kind of a pain. And if you don't need to, this is easy. What you're doing is easier. So, but if we had to do it in the field, we would definitely do that for sure. It sounds really cool. So, yeah.
What have you observed in the way of other species, birds, mammals, invertebrates occupying the burrows?
Yeah, so we had talked earlier at the beginning, we get rattlesnakes occasionally, mostly in the front of the burrows because it's probably a little warm there as well and a bit of sheltered, but then we'll be like, oh, there's a rattlesnake in that one. We're not going to go and plunge that burrow. We'll just leave that one. And so we've created some snake habitat, which is great. In the winter, when the owls have migrated, definitely we get rodents occupying the burrows. So they've set up shop in there, and which is great because then they've provided owl food for when the owls come back. We also get lots of black widows living in the tops of the burrows. So, which is fine for us because they just sort of stay. We just lift up the lids. They're usually just kind of underneath there, and they don't seem to bother the birds either. I know, right? I used to be so afraid of spiders, but now I'm like, black widows, whatever. We also get spadefoot toads, like they sort of live in the grasslands, and sometimes they'll go in there, or the owls will actually bring them and eat them. And we've had these nuttles, cottontails, sometimes use them as well. Yellow-bellied marmots will go, especially over the winter. A lot of animals will be like, oh, I'm going to use this as sort of a refuge. But generally by the spring, they've kind of cleared out and the owls are occupying them. They'll kind of keep other things out. So, yeah.
Excuse me. You had mentioned avian flu with regards to availability of chicks, but how else has it affected your operations?
So, generally, it seems like the owls haven't been susceptible to them, or the burrowing owls so far, which is great. One of our breeding facilities is close to some chicken and duck farms, so we're always worried that they'll shut us down or something. The government shuts us down. We do just like have a little foot bath at the front. And actually, we've had hand sanitizer for the last bit because of COVID. We just didn't want transmission between volunteers. So now for that. But yeah, it's mostly affected like our food source right now. And we're also close to rehab centers. So we don't, and they sometimes can possibly bring in that as well. So we actually don't have volunteers that do both centers. We just have volunteers that do ours. If we do have ones that do both, we make sure that volunteer does the owls first. So, but yeah, that's always been a bit of concern too. There was also that concern about West Nile, but it seems like the owls were okay with that as well. It seems like the burrowing owls seem to be pretty good. Like I know Kay McKeever was worried about that, but they never got West Nile either. So, which is good. But yeah.
At least her burrowing owls didn't get West
Yeah,
Nile.
her burrowing owls didn't.
The other ones got slaughtered.
Yeah, the others got, well, that's what she said. Like the others were just like, but the burrowing owls were fine. Yeah, that's it. So I'm like, what? So, yeah.
So how long are the artificial burrows compared to how long are natural burrows?
So artificial burrows can last 2, 3, maybe 5 years. And then our artificial burrows should last 10 plus years as long as they're maintained well. So yeah, so quite a bit of a difference. Though, we're starting to learn too, like maybe maybe their ecology is sort of based on like the movement of burrows as well. So maybe having one burrow in one spot for a long time, maybe they will nest there and there for a while, but then maybe they'll abandon it for a bit and maybe come back to it later, sort of mimicking that natural burrow, because the natural burrows wouldn't be there for that long. But still not quite sure on some of that. So yeah, but we do leave like some sign that other owls have been there. So if another owl has been at that burrow, it makes it more appealing for another owl to come, like at the beginning. But then once an owl is stable there, they'll put up more signs so that nobody else comes. So we do leave like a few little pellets and poop at the front, so that hopefully when the migrating owls are coming back, they'll see that and be like, okay, that's a good burrow to go to. And they've done a study down in California, which is really cool, San Diego, about putting like painting poop on rocks and stuff like that to sort of keep the owls there. They'll be like, oh, this is great. The other owls have pooped here. I'm paraphrasing their research, but it's really neat. So
I'm assuming they were actually asking about the length of the tunnel of the burrow.
Oh, the length.
But that was very interesting.
The length. Oh, okay. Well, ours are about 10 feet long. And it just depends on the animal. Like with badgers, they can make super long ones. I know with David Johnson's, like he's got some tubing that was like 10 or 12 or 14 feet or even 20 feet long. So they meet quite down there. And I mean, if it gets too long, we can't really see it down there, but probably David's listening and he's like, no, Lauren, what are you talking about? Again, like I said, we swap between feet and meters. So sometimes I get confused with that, but they can be a bit longer. They can also be shorter too. And with the natural burrows, then we have to use a camera or peeper to look for them. And it's a lot harder to grab them. We have special traps to trap the young when they're coming out of the front. So the artificial burrows are great for like cleaning and knowing how many owls there are and all that kind of stuff. But definitely we want natural burrows, and we've had a few around. But again, they're just not as many, at least in our area. And I would like to do better surveys in BC, but we just haven't had the capacity. So.
Are you able to travel to different provinces to give presentations with live owls in schools, middle, high school level? And if so, what has been the influence on kids introduced to wild creatures?
So I just do presentations mostly in BC and just kind of close to me. But I know like in Manitoba, Alex does presentations, and some people in Alberta and Saskatchewan do some local presentations. There is a burrowing owl interpretive center in Saskatchewan that does quite a bit. So yeah, I mean, definitely we try and visit kids and lots of other groups as well to kind of get them to know about burrowing owls. Because even though people see a lot of photos of them, but they don't exactly know their ecology, where they live, their life, that they are endangered. A lot of people are actually surprised by that because they'll see lots of pictures of them. And that they live underground, which is a totally unique thing for an owl. And they find that really interesting. And about grasslands and prairie landscapes and just how endangered they are as well. And so I think, really little kids are maybe not necessarily taking all that, but they'll tell their parents, like we introduce them to a few new words like extirpated and crepuscular. That's always a good one because burrowing owls are crepuscular. So hunting at dusk and dawn mostly. So, because a lot of people think all owls are nocturnal, and you're like, well, that's not true. So they have lots of different strategies. So hopefully that answered your question. Unfortunately, Canada's so big, traveling to another province takes a long time. So I don't really do that unless somebody wanted to pay me.
Well, with Zoom now you can, do
I can do it. Yeah. It would take me like 8 hours to drive just to the next province. So yeah, it's quite far. So yeah.
And they're not going to let you cross into the United States 1 hour.
No, not with an owl.
Live bird.
And actually, even within provinces in Canada, it's a little like iffy about that. Like even when I gave like those education owls to Saskatchewan and Manitoba, we had to do some permitting stuff as well. We did have our one of our first education owls with Mike Merlin. He went to Ottawa to promote a national park, which is finally starting to come together now, but he went 15 years ago with the owl, and that was a lot of paperwork to take the owl there. So
that's all of the submitted
okay.
questions we have, but I have a question.
Oh,
So
okay, sure. Yeah.
BC recently ban rodenticides. Is that right?
They did just like within the last month. So yeah.
So is that like a flat out nobody can use them ban, or what does that amount to, and how do you expect that to shake out, or just wait and see?
Yeah, I'm just waiting and seeing right now. I'm not sure exactly. I'm thinking it's certain types, but the only thing that I'm worried about with that is how are people going to put rodents down after that. I also work with a lot of people on cats, and so I still love cats, so I still got to do some stuff with cats, but are people going to revert back to having outdoor cats a bit more again too? So we want to make sure that people keep their cats inside. But that's only just come in recently, which is really awesome, and a lot of work that's done by some barn owl people on the coast to really push that too. So I don't know all the ins and outs of it yet, but once I figure that out, I can let you know. But it's a really cool thing that's happened. So.
And one of my other questions was, you mentioned telling males from females apart. Are there physical characteristics, or is it all behavioral characteristics?
So there is some physical one in just during the breeding season. And then I find after that, they kind of look the same again, but the female gets a little bit darker because she's in the burrow a lot doing the nest, and the male actually gets a little bit lighter. He gets a little bleached out. And then he has that white eyebrow, and he does, this is what I do at kids' presentations. I'm like, you guys know how to do this? Because female burrowing owls love that. They love a big white bushy eyebrow. So I find that's more prominent at that time. And then the males too will do this. They get a thing called a square head. They'll kind of go like this, and their feathers go out. And so if they're really into that, and the males some females kind of do it a little bit as well. So sometimes you can get a little confused. Some of the big like piles, the birding thing, like they say the females are like 160 something grams and the males are 165 or something, like, and it's like so minuscule, you can't tell at all. So, and sometimes some females look a little male and sometimes some males look a little female. David Johnson always says, like, when we pick up a bird and it's like really squawking, he says it's a female, but I was like, I don't think so. I just anyway, that might be true with some other raptor species. Maybe the female's more aggressive, but I found like the males tend to be a bit more aggressive with the burrowing owls, because they're definitely too, like when we go out in the field, if we get too close to a burrow, like some are quite aggressive and they'll like come and bop you on the back of the head if you get too close to their burrow. So only had the males do that. So, but yeah, so just to be safe, we do the DNA testing, because like when they're little, you have no idea. But so B might display some of those, but she's not going to be in a burrow as much, like say as a breeding female. So she might not get as dark as some of the other females do during the breeding season. So yeah.
She's already very dark.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, that's cool.
I remember David Johnson showing some photos of burrowing owls in a spot in Brazil that were really red. They were like
so cool.
Red from the soil.
Yeah, it's kind of cool, like how different, how the same they look, but also how different. Yeah. I was down in Argentina at a zoo, and the owls they had some young ones there and it looked exactly the same. And then we found, they were asking me too, it was a kind of a cool thing, is like when we bring our loths in and we feed them, their eyes are kind of really a pale yellow. And then compared to the owls in the wild, they're like a very bright yellow. But then once we put them back in the wild, like within a couple of weeks, we look back and we can't tell. They all have that really bright. And so in Argentina, all of theirs were kind of pale. And I said, that happens to our captive ones too. they're just very pale, but then once they're back in the wild, it gets very, and I just don't know why. So I don't know what bees are like.
Hers are very pale also, much paler than the wild ones. Now, here's really interesting. So guys in Saskatchewan that banned great horned owls have noticed that the great horned owls that nest in buildings, so they've got a lot of abandoned barns and houses they nest in, the young ones have very pale eyes, but the ones that are in outdoor nests have much darker eyes. That for interesting.
Yeah, so I'm like, is it a light thing or is it certain vitamins or I was just like, it's so cool. And the fact that they had the same thing down in Argentina, and I wonder, maybe this is for other owls, all other owls too. Like,
so if somebody's watching and looking for a research project, check out eye
coloration.
Eye coloration in birds, owls that are in indoor or lower light places versus full light.
Yeah. And then I thought it was interesting that even ours, like, then it changed back when they went into the wild, because I thought, okay, well, maybe it would just stay like that, but no, it so it's kind of cool.
Owls are basically so cool, and
there's so much
to learn.
There's so much to talk about and learn. So
okay, I think we've wrapped up all the questions.
Great.
hang on, I might have another one here. Nope.
No.
Just a few things to wrap up. So we do have a few more on the docket for this winter, a few more speakers. It's not as many as the first winter, which was every Sunday. The next one we have on the schedule is January 8th, and that's going to be Denver Holt. We don't have title pinned down, but I think it's going to be on snowy owls. Just stay tuned and you'll find out. And February 5th, Hannah Tutongi from Duluth, Minnesota is going to be talking about her hawk owl research, putting transmitters on them to see where they're going, because not that much work has been done on hawk owls. So that'll be exciting. And if you want to keep up with those, you can either watch our Facebook pages or subscribe to the Owl Center's e-newsletter. Just go to internationalowlcenter.org and there'll be a pop-up box where you can sign up. And there's two different e-newsletters. One is Owl Center programs and general things, and one is geared more for scientific things, and these we put on both of our e-newsletters. So the other one is more, here's recent owl research, here's owl conference updates, here's this speaker series, things like that. But the other one is all the programming we have and all the news that's going on with the Owl Center. But either one will have updates on when these programs are happening. And as I mentioned, the World Owl Conference will be October 23 to 27 in 2023 in La Crosse, Wisconsin. This presentation will be saved on our YouTube channel. So again, you can find that either by going to International Owl Center on YouTube and finding our actual page, and then look for the playlist for the Virtual Owl Expert Speaker Series. Or we will also post the link to that on the Owl Center website, internationalowlcenter.org, under programs, and then look under Virtual Owl Expert Speaker Series. That will have the upcoming ones as well as links to all of them that have been recorded. So thank you very much, Lauren. Thank you to everybody who watched and was learning along with us. This is like the best staff development that we can have for our staff, learning from people all over the world. So we appreciate it very much. And thank you to everybody that donated to help us be able to keep this free for everybody, because there's a whole lot that goes on behind the scenes to make this happen. And by donating, that helps us be able to do that with our staff and volunteers also. So thank you all very much, and hope to see you again January 8th for Denver Holt. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Carla. Thanks, Joe.